So this is the summary of it. From 1945 to date, you find that Africa began to attain its independence. And as Africa attained its independence, and with the emergence of the African indigenous churches, you find that there was an awakening of a hope for a better Africa. And you find that within the 1970s, 1960s, as many African countries began to attain their independence, and through the interaction of the liberation fighters with the Soviet Union, with Cuba, with China, you find that independent Africa predominantly adopted African socialism as the model of governance within the African context. But we need to appreciate that this African socialism was coming in the context where we were now having the indigenous African churches, which were trying to reconnect with their African heritage spiritually, but at the same time also upholding the Christian teachings. And we also need to appreciate that as Africa gained its independence, it was coming from a period close to 100 years of colonization, where Africa, during that time, it had been disconnected. The life of the African, as he had known it pre-colonization, had been transformed and changed. And as I said, and I continue to emphasize, that pre-colonization, the African's life was connected. It was intertwined, the spiritual and the physical and the material. So the economic, the political, and the social aspects of the Africans' life were very much informed and connected to their faith, to their religion and their spirituality. But within those 100 years, you find that the economic and the political aspect of the whole existence of the African was disconnected from their spirituality, because they then did not have the privilege or the place to be dictating their own destinies in as far as their economies, in as far as their politics was concerned. So independent Africa was coming from this reality, where for close to 100 years it had been disconnected. The political and economic life of Africa had been disconnected from its spiritual life. So what the colonial masters had done is they allowed for the continuation of the social aspect or the social connection between everyday life and the spirituality of the African. So that's why you find that on the most part, when we now talk of African traditional religion, we are mostly making reference to the social aspect of the African traditional religion. We are looking at family rights. We are looking about the rights of the dead. The whole concept within the Shona culture, it's called Kuroba Makuba, where you go through ceremonies to bring back the spirits of the dead. We are looking at the whole concept of respect and honor, the whole concept of marriage, of lobola. So the social side of the African, its connectedness with their spirituality, you find that the colonial masters did not touch much, but the economic and the political was disconnected from their spirituality. So independent Africa was coming with this background. So African socialism, you find that it found a place within the African context, which is now disconnected. So the politics of Africa and the economics of Africa, as it became independent, post-colonialism was now divorced from its spirituality. It was now divorced from its spirituality. So even with the advent of the African indigenous churches, you find that their spirituality did not extend to the economy of the African states. It did not extend to the politics of the African states as well. So you find that as Africa began to practice socialism, African socialism, and as a result of that disconnection that happened over the 100 years of colonization, you find that the moral and ethical code that kept the African community together was also disrupted. There was a disintegration of the moral and ethical code of the African society as a whole, as the political and the economic aspects of daily life was disconnected from their spirituality. And you find that, as I've already indicated, that colonial Christianity also was silent, deliberately silent about the moral and ethical side of Christianity. So this is also very key as we are looking at post-independent Africa, as we are looking at post-colonial Africa, as we are looking at the African indigenous churches. So the African indigenous churches were so much characterized with power, spiritual power. And you find that from a political perspective now, as Africa took to ruling and governing itself, but now with that reality of a deficient moral and ethical code, you find that African socialism was marred by gross corruption. So 1960s and 1970s, you find that Africans did not realize the hope that they had for Africa. The hope for a better Africa post-independence was not realized because of that deficiency that had been created over the 100 years of colonization. So we move from the 1970s, corruption is rampant, and now the Western world is beginning also to come down on Africa. There's a call now for Africa to begin to democratize, to go for democracy. So there was democratization of Africa now as we went into the 1990s. And we need to appreciate that the 1980s was regarded, is generally regarded as a lost decade for Africa. Why? Because as the cause for change in post-independent Africa became louder in the 1970s, and the Western powers that had been supporting, that had been doing business now with the new African governance, began to call for reforms within the governance systems. You find that 1980 was characterized by a lot of reforms within the governance systems in Africa, but these reforms were only superficial. So the reforms was, if Africa was now going for the privatization route, but you find that it only further promoted corruption because it was only the elites of the ruling government would also then tend to benefit from that privatization process. But in the eyes of the West, Africa was reforming, so aid continued to come. Aid continued to come. But in reality, there was no real reform or reformation that was happening. So Africa, you find that during that whole decade, not much development was observed. And as you'd expect, there now began a deterioration of the infrastructure that even Africa had inherited from its colonial masters in the 1980s, which also gave to louder cries by the African civilians now. And this led to the 1990s call for the democratization of Africa, if Africa was to continue to receive aid from its Western counterparts. So the 1990s also then gave rise to the African Renaissance. Take note, we are having the African indigenous churches, and we are also now having the African Renaissance. And former South African President Thabo Mbeki is one of the champions of the African Renaissance in the 1990s, where now, upon realization that indeed Africa was on the wrong trajectory, if Africa continued on the trajectory that it was on, it was never going to fulfill the aspirations of its people, then Africa was not going to develop at the same rate as its global counterparts. So there was this call of the need for Africa to reconnect yet again with its original African religious roots.